Hello, welcome to a new lecture series that is happening in conjunction with the exhibition Magnetic North, Imagining Canada in Painting from 1910 to 1940. I will be here in this digital lecture series that is happening. My name is Bart Pushaw. I am an art historian affiliated now at the University of Copenhagen, where I am a member in the research project, The Art of Nordic Colonialism, writing transcultural art histories. You might be wondering, why is a Nordic art person speaking about Canadian art? And that's because I work on also Arctic art history. And we'll see today ways in which Canadian Arctic art is also connected to these larger ideas of what's happening in the circumpolar north. So I'm very delighted and honored to be able to kick off this lecture series. Without further ado, I just wanted to thank the SCHIRN Kunsthalle for inviting me and providing this space to talk to all of you tonight. And afterward, you can pose questions in the chat functions, depending on where you're watching this, whether it's on the museum website, on Facebook, or on Zoom. And then I'll try to answer those questions to the best of my ability afterwards. And then we'll wrap up the evening. So thank you very much for being here. And I will just switch over and get the presentation started. Okay, so the title of this talk has sort of various titles, but right now I have settled on this title of Indigenous Modernists and the Settler Ecologies of Interwar Canadian Art. So this is very much a sort of very recent research that I've been doing, so I'm excited to share all of it with you in the context of what the exhibition is doing right now and the sort of questions it's trying to provoke and the narratives that it's trying to complicate. And I wanted to start with a series of paintings that are currently on display at the exhibition that I wanted to sort of use as a launching point to talk about the ideas that we'll be discussing today. So you'll see here there are three oil paintings, all by probably arguably one of the most famous Canadian oil painters, Lawren Harris. And these are some of his most famous paintings, especially the two on the left of his icebergs, right, that he's made. So you'll see here in this juxtaposition that there are two iceberg paintings, one titled Grounded, Icebergs from 1931, in the middle, Icebergs Davis Strait from 1930, and then here in the picture on the right, an earlier painting, Lake Superior, not in the Arctic, but of course in Canada. And these paintings are sort of chronologically at near the end period of what we call the Group of Seven in Canadian art history. And of course, if you're watching this, you're probably familiar with the Group of Seven as the sort of founding figures of Canadian modern art history and the ways in which they're using art to shape a sort of cohesive idea of what Canada is. And this is happening above all through landscape painting. So the majority of the paintings, though not all of them, are landscape paintings. And this is important in the context of Canada and the way in which it's trying to reconceive itself. A really important departure point, though, for the exhibition is kind of complicating the ways in which landscape painting is not only seen as, right, as something that is aesthetically beautiful, but in ways in which images are more deeply connected to political and social and intercultural and even colonial agendas. Now, when you look at, especially in the case of Lawren Harris and his icebergs paintings, you might maybe question what exactly about images of icebergs could be political. And when you look at them, right, it's very easy to see why they're very popular, right? Because they take these images of icebergs, right, and they distill them, for instance, on the right, um, and his images of icebergs in the Davis Strait, how he's distilling them into geometries, and we see these really slick modernist ways in which he's combining and thinking about nature, and thinking, moving towards abstraction. And so there are ways in which these paintings are very often seen, because they are aesthetically beautiful, as seen as being apolitical or not remotely connected to being political, especially images like icebergs, because no one lives on them. So this is a sort of trope that we'll kind of investigate, because as the sort of research of many art historians have begun to show, in the ways in which Canadian settler white Canadian artists are thinking about the Arctic, especially in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, is that they're very much framing it as a way and using art and using images of the Arctic, and what they're creating and painting as ways to assert, as you can see in this really, I think, telling quote, right, to assert Canadian political sovereignty, right, to establish sort of unequivocally that this area of the North, whether it's both these frozen glaciers, right, or these seemingly desolate landscapes, right, are part of Canada just as much as the southern part of Canada, which the group had been painting, of course, by this point for over maybe 15 years, right? Uh, and so it also really, right, there's a way in which it still might not necessarily be very obvious why paintings of icebergs could be political. And a really sort of driving point behind the exhibition is thinking about how very often, especially in the settler colonial context of the Americas, right, in which landscape painting is very often a tool of indigenous erasure, right, that in focusing on these ideas and these grand vistas of nature and of landscape painting, and either having them completely devoid of people, or you see in the Jackson painting in the upper right corner that you do see some Inuit, but they're rendered at a very small scale, right? They're in the landscape, but they're also somewhat part of the landscape in how they're depicted, right? Their presence is somewhat incidental, right, rather than central to it. And this is a really common trope and a common problem that happens when you think about landscape painting in settler colonial states. And so, right, because of that, there is also a question of what exactly is the role and how do we think about indigenous peoples at this time. Now, I will say that here I have this map of the Davis Strait where I've zoomed in on where exactly Lawren Harris and A.Y. Jackson are painting and making these images of the Arctic when they go on this expedition in 1930. And I think this is an interesting point, because when we see in these letters that Jackson and Harris are talking about the ways in which they're creating and displaying and exhibiting paintings of the Arctic as political statements, right, and establishing Canadian rule over the Arctic, that actually, especially in the case of Harris and his iceberg paintings, they're actually very explicitly tied to landscapes in Pannirtuuq or Greenland. And so we know that actually, really, this is ironically, these paintings of icebergs that are meant to be very Canadian are actually instead in Pannirtuuq or Inuit territory in Greenland, which in the 1920s and 30s, as so today, right, has a very different kind of colonial relationship that is intimately connected with Denmark. This is, of course, where the Nordic connection for me comes into play. So I just wanted to show this map to you, right? Because sometimes when we think of landscape paintings as these sort of vistas or postcard picturesque images, they're very often disembodied, ironically, from the places where they're made. And I think, right, when we see that actually these glaciers, these mobile, right, mountains of ice are very fluid in this way, that of course are not respecting political boundaries and national borders. And so I think they become a really good opportunity to also begin to question what exactly is happening really in the Arctic when we maybe stop thinking about it in national terms of dividing between, for instance, Canada and Greenland, and think more specifically about the shared Inuit cultural space that is also existing in the 1920s and 30s. Now, what's also really important about this map that I had just shown you is that also it includes this village of Panniktuk. And Panniktuk is an important town for us today, because this is not only the place where Harris and Jackson had arrived and to begin painting their Arctic images, right? But also a place that has its own very distinctive indigenous history that is also directly connected with the direction that the Hudson Bay Company in Canada is moving. So in these two paintings, you see how both Harris and Jackson are turning towards, right, this mountainous landscape. And you see it especially in Harris, in the middle, these images here, right, where you see these Inuit tents. This is summertime, of course, and the ways in which they've really kind of, the way that he's reducing painting into these flat areas of color here, right? He's using this kind of slick geometry and way of painting that we saw with some of his iceberg images he's painting around the same time. And he's using that kind of geometrical visual language, right, to condense these shapes. And in condensing these shapes, right, he also makes these Inuit tents really indistinguishable from the stones and rocks and mountains around them. So there is this really strange fiction, right, to Harris's images, where at once, okay, you see Inuit tents and you see it's titled Inuit tents, but there's really otherwise no presence, right? It's this weird sort of phenomenon of visibility, but also very clear invisibility. In Harris's image, right, you do get a tiny bit more, right? You have these small Inuit figures who stand by this tent, but there's really no sort of degree of connection to their humanity or who these people are as individuals, right? Again, they're part of this picturesque landscape, and if anything, add to this kind of exoticism by which white settler Canadians are looking and consuming these images. Now, what's important is that, of course, the minute you begin to question the artists that you look at, that are working in this space at this time, you can have a really sort of radically different picture of what is really happening and what had happened historically in this part of the Arctic in the late 1920s and 1930s. So here I just show you 3 watercolor portraits by a Danish artist named Oda Isprint. These were just featured actually at a really wonderful pioneering exhibition at the Nuuk Art Museum in Greenland that was focusing on 3 Danish women artists who were very active and in portraying Inuit women and Greenlandic and Kahlerit landscapes. So I just show you these watercolors just so that you're aware that this trope of erasing Indigenous people and erasing Inuit sort of modernity is not necessarily true. And the minute that, even when we just question, and we're still looking at a white settler artist, we're still looking at a Danish artist here, but the minute we kind of just begin to broaden our perspectives of the artists that we look at, right, can bring us radically different results that don't really remotely at all fall into this trap of Indigenous erasure, and instead present really exciting opportunities. And I will also say this is really the first time, I mean, this exhibition is, I think it just ended or is ending very soon. So this is also really kind of cutting edge art history also happening in Greenland. But I will say, of course, that there have been curatorial attempts to really grapple with how do we deal with the fact that these paintings so often erase Inuit life from them. And so one instance occurred in this exhibition of the Art Gallery of Ontario, where curators had decided to juxtapose some of Harris's Arctic paintings with enlarged photographs that Harris himself took of Inuit when he was in Pandituk. So when he's in this Arctic region, right, it's, and you can also sort of see in some of the sort of critical commentary about this exhibition, that, right, by displaying these photographs, right, and having this kind of blatant evidence, right, that Emily Lawrence says in this critique, right, of the artist sort of his very obvious conscious painterly disregard, right? So it's kind of really exposing the way in which he's making Harris, right, as a white settler Canadian artist trying to make political images of the Arctic that he's thinking very deliberately, right? It's also a way that art historians are not maybe over-interpreting it, but actually you see this direct evidence, right, that he knows this. At the end of this exhibition review, Emily Lawrence also brings up this question, right, that the curators had also talked about, that of course by creating images of the Arctic as not being inhabited by people, it also contributes to this idea of the Arctic as barren, empty, and unpopulated, right? And so she asked this question of why are they not incorporating an Indigenous voice or a narrative in response to this kind of idea of erasure. And this is a very popular curatorial decision. This is something that is happening at the SCHIRN that of course there are many different Indigenous artists that are included in the exhibition, and very much part of including their work as contemporary artists is also to make the 500 different Indigenous groups that live across Canada also visible, and their perspectives visible, and oftentimes you see that they're speaking back, right, to this kind of idea of white settler erasure. So of course, in the case of Pandituk, we have a really great example, right? You also have works from the Paniktuk weaving studio. That Pandituk becomes a very important center in the establishment of contemporary Inuit art after the 1950s, and really in the 60s, 70s, and 80s becomes especially famous for these weaving tapestries. And so of course you see in Inuit-made images of Inuit life and of Inuit themselves, that you see these children in a very similar, right, the similar idea of this summer camp, right, in these mobile homes. And also the sense of joy, of wonderness, right? And it provides a really obvious, distinct alternative, right? Sort of revelation of what actual Indigenous reality really is, right? In comparison with Harris's images. And this is great. This is a really important way in which we incorporate Indigenous artists, Indigenous voices, and change these narratives. But what I want to do for the rest of the talk is pursue a different way of thinking about how we incorporate and change art historical narratives, that it's not always necessarily, that we don't always burden contemporary artists with having to speak back when we maybe challenge some ideas of what the archive can reveal to us. So I wanted to show you, if you follow Inuit art at all, you know this week is a very important week because this week is the opening of Kamaiuk, which is the Inuit Art Center that is opening in Winnipeg. And what's especially exciting for me about Kamaiuk is also the fact that they're really expanding and making clear the diverse possibilities of what Inuit art is. And in their collection is this really enigmatic sculpture of trees by an artist attributed to an artist named Oppa. And it's made of walrus ivory, and you see it's two trees, right, with various branches. There are no leaves, and it's set on a wooden base. Now, why am I showing this to you? Because you see here in this sort of screenshot from the museum that it's from this collection of the art museum that was a gift of E. Prudence Hawken. And this is a really interesting fact because we know very clearly that E. Prudence Hawken was a nurse who lived in Panniktuk in the 1930s and 40s. And so very clearly, right, just from establishing this collection history, suddenly we're looking at Panniktuk, and we of course see that when we look at Panniktuk and we see these are archival photographs of Panniktuk from the 1930s and early 1940s, that Hawken, she is here in this photograph on the left, she's this woman here on the left, that she is a nurse at this hospital, which had been, when it was built in 1930, the greatest, the sort of largest building, and in Paniktuk, which is a very new settlement, and is really kind of the beginning of a new and often very pernicious politics of assimilation for Inuit by establishing settlement towns. But in this period, in the 30s, and in 1930 in particular, the hospital opens, and because it's so big, it's not only a center, of course, for attending to medical concerns, but also becomes a social center where artists especially are coming and trading and bartering their wares and their art. And so what's especially exciting about that is it also complicates this idea of what we think, or what we often talk about as happening in Inuit history and in Inuit art history. So oftentimes when we talk about Inuit art in the 1920s and 1930s, we don't really actually talk about it. And instead, oftentimes, this is because of the way in which Inuit relationships with Canada have really drastically changed in this period, because of these dramatic environmental changes. And so this is namely that, of course, the fact that first whaling had occurred at really such a devastating rate by settler and European white whalers, dating as early as the 17th century, but it becomes especially destructive in the 19th century, that many bowhead whales especially are driven almost to the brink of extinction. This also happens with other species of animals that we'll talk about in a second, and also conflicted relationships with sealing. And so this means that by the 1920s, and as animal populations are changing, the Hudson Bay Company essentially employs Inuit, and they're hunting Arctic foxes, and for their white skin, as you see in the left. On the right, you see a photograph of Inuit that are hauling beluga whale skin, which is also a way in which animal populations are changing, and right there, a new sort of forced subsistence relationship with the land is really sort of transforming Inuit lived experience at this time. Now, what also happens is there are warming of the seas in the 1920s and early 1930s that completely change Arctic environments. And this ends up also really devastating a lot of marine mammal populations, and one of them are also walruses. And so in 1928, the government passes a new legislation about the protection of walruses, and it talks about in very clear terms that the only people that are allowed to kill and hunt walruses are natives on their own volition. This ends up kind of being a problem because in 1931 they changed the law, as you see here, to how they're protecting walruses, and they use very explicit racial terms. They talk about no Inuk or any person of indigenous ancestry is allowed to kill more than 7 walruses in 1 year, etc. And that you see any person of the white race shall kill no more than 4 walruses in any year. But there are also various exceptions, and one of them that's interesting for our concerns is this provision, which in D says that the export of walrus tusks can only happen if they're carved or sort of worked up for sale in a retail way. So what does this mean, right? This means that the laws are changing, and essentially creating a situation in which Inuit are able to barter and benefit from trading ivory, walrus ivory, when it's carved. And this is interesting because then it begins to explain the ways in which there is this really vibrant community of ivory carvers that are living in Panniktuk in the 1920s and 30s, where they're making a variety of objects, especially the most common one are cribbage boards. Right? It is also a game piece that begins being carved in ivory in the Arctic, being in Alaska, but sometimes they take on more imaginative forms, like you see in the sailing ship on the right, that is in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum. But that also brings us back to this image that I talked about in the collection of Kamayuk by Oppa. And so suddenly, right, this image becomes really interesting because, of course, it's not only a sculpture of trees, but it's a sculpture of trees that is also made from walrus tusk. And right in the hunting of those walruses is already engaged in a very fraught, complicated environmental history, right, that is changing because of the ways in which settler Canadians had overexploited marine resources, which created this very fraught need and relationship between Inuit and walruses in this period. Now, what's also interesting about Oppa in particular is that we have a really wonderful entry about him in a diary of one of the doctors who worked at the hospital in Pandituk, where we know that Inuit came and traded their ivory-wares, including this sculpture of trees that was collected by the nurse Prudence Hawken, the white nurse Prudence Hawken. And what I really like about this quote from this diary from Dr. John Bidwell is that he talks about oppa being very famous in Panniktuk for his originality. And I really like this description he uses, which is that many of his designs have not been solved to this day and probably never will be, right? So what he's talking about here, for instance, in this sculpture of trees, is that really how it is incredibly astounding how oppa had been able to create these small, slender branches out of very tough ivory, right? In a way that their incorporation with the actual tusk. So we see, for instance, the ways in which we can tell, right, uh, maybe how the original walrus tusk or the pair of tusks had arrived to Appa before he had carved them. And you can see the way in which it curves, right, how he's thinking and had thought about using those shapes to create these trees. But what's especially interesting is how he's using these branches, right? I mean, in this way that is incredibly difficult in ivory, and often, right. And this is what Bidwell means here when he says that his designs have not been solved. Right, that it's almost inconceivable how he was able to make and manage materials in this way. And then, of course, he also talks about them turning them out quickly in like a highly specialized factory, which is also an interesting way of thinking about it. Uh, but I also just wanted to bring up this image, right? Because suddenly, right, when we think of what Indigenous artists are making, right, you see that actually this image of sort of barren trees shares a very striking similarity, right, with these very famous images by Canadian modernists. So by, for instance, Lawren Harris of Lake Superior, which again is not the Arctic, but right, you share this image of these white barren trees, and there's a way with Harris that it almost these trees assume almost this kind of stone-like appearance, right? And I think what's interesting about this juxtaposition, right, is not just that they look similar, right? And I certainly do not mean any kind of influence between Lawren Harris and Oppa, absolutely not. But what is interesting is the fact that these artists are sharing these spaces at the same time, and yet they present almost completely opposite images of what Canada is in the 1920s and 30s, right? That in Lawren Harris's image, right, of this lake landscape and these stony sort of rocks and boulders at the shore, right, is almost completely devoid of life, right? There are rocks and there are trees that honestly look dead. We have the same kind of trees with Appa on the left, but instead we have, it's almost the complete opposite, right? They're full of life, not only from the fact that they're harvested from animals and from a very specific Inuit relationship and idea of reciprocity in hunting walruses and obtaining ivory and taking that ivory to transform it into something else, right? So there's already a living embodied relationship in the use of ivory, let alone the way the artist is transforming it into another kind of lived phenomenon. But I think what's especially interesting is that if you look very closely, you see these small, very miniature carvings of animals that are living, or at least, temporarily, right, on these branches. And what I think about that is really makes it, I think, this sculpture by Appa a really great and powerful visual metaphor for the ways in which the same image, right, of these white trees that look and seem barren are actually incredibly rich and vibrant and full of life in a way that we can also see as a metaphor, right, for the way in which we know, of course, that Inuit lived experience, of course, in Panniktuk and in this larger circumpolar region is also equally vibrant, right? And so I think my point in bringing up these conversations and putting them together is also thinking about the ways in which um, when we think about how we question, right, and we think about Indigenous erasure or the absence of Indigenous people, right, that we don't necessarily always have to focus on these white settler Canadian artists and necessarily always um, juxtapose them with contemporary artists of Indigenous artists that live and work among us as our friends and colleagues. But we can also, right, when we change how we look at the archive and the images that are already there waiting for us, right, we have a much more enriched idea of how Canada has been represented, right, how Canadians have represented it, and also how Inuit art has always been a fundamental sort of facet of Canadian art history, instead of a sort of different relationship that is very much connected to this contemporary period after 1950. So I realize I'm just sort of almost at the 30-minute mark. So I will finish my talk there, but I will open the floor now for questions. I will stop sharing my screen. So if there's any questions, I'm very happy to address them, and I hope I didn't speak too quickly. So thank you for listening. Okay, so I think we have a little bit of a delay, but there are no questions yet. So thank you very much for joining us today. And please stay tuned for other events that are connected to this exhibition of Magnetic North and Imagining Canada in Painting from 1910 to 1940. And please follow the SCHIRN Kunsthalle to see other sort of events that are happening. So thank you very much for coming, and have a great evening.